So here we go. It's the Osborne Era, 1973 to 1997. 25 seasons, and yet Boomer, correct me on my math here, 13 and 13 does not add up to 25. So
no, it does not. Yeah.
So something happened, I think, that we'll get to that would lead to that being an uneven number there. But to go through what these years were, again, it's all about streaks. It starts off here with Barry Switzer in Oklahoma, which, by the way, Barry Switzer and Osborne took over the same season, 1973. Switzer has early success. Then there's the little streak in the early 80s, back to some success of Oklahoma, and then Osborne finishes strong. So let's start with you, Mike, here. Kind of walk us in. It's 1973. Devaney has just left. They did lose the last game of the Devaney era in 72, so now we're starting with Osborne. And obviously Oklahoma starting fresh with Switzer too. What's kind of going on with the programs, and how is the series? What's happening in 1973?
Well, 1973, I'm sure that there's optimism still because Nebraska, two of the previous 3 years, they've got national championships, and Tom is the handpicked successor, and Bob's the athletic director, and, things are looking good there from that standpoint. Bob got what he wanted in terms of who was going to follow him. Barry Switzer comes in, Tom and Barry come in at the same time, and then 5 consecutive losses, and frustration is to the point where Tom, in 1978, Tom goes to Colorado, applies for the job at Colorado, gets to the point where he actually goes and has a talk with the players at Colorado, and then decides that he says, I decided that I couldn't coach against players that I had recruited at Nebraska and whatever. So he doesn't go. But I mean, think about that. Every year, Tom's teams always won at least 9 games and went to a bowl game. And people are frustrated because they can't beat Oklahoma. It's like it's a 1-game season.
Yeah. Well, that was on that
Oklahoma.
That was on that audio of the opening clip of the show tonight, was Osborne before the 78 game saying that's the one game, that people defined your season, because to your point, we're winning. I think he said, about a 77% clip, in those first 3, 4, 5 seasons. And there was a point in a bowl game where we had beaten Texas Tech, I think, in the Bluebonnet Bowl. And if we hadn't, some Regent came up to him and said he'd been fired.
Was there a petition?
Regent said it's a good thing you won that game. It's like, what? He has a success, but he doesn't beat Oklahoma, and it's like, that's it. You beat Oklahoma, or we're not happy, we're upset about it, and then he beats his 78 team beats Oklahoma, and then they got to play him in a bowl game again, and they lose again.
Well, that gets to be that odd number. Well, as we're getting through those mid 70s here, here's a graphic, Sooner Magic. 1976. What does Sooner Magic mean? Let's watch a clip here on Sooner Magic.
Here we go.
3.5 minutes to play. The Sooners took over on its own 16-yard line. Offensive coordinator Galen Hall up in the press box planned the final strategy with head coach Barry Switzer.
With the time left in the game, we thought we could move the ball, but we had 85 yards to go, so we had to have a big play of some type. And the first play that came to mind was the halfback pass, which we have had in all year. And so we put Woody Shepard in the game because he throws it the best. He hit Steve Rhodes, and we got the big play we needed to get us out of the hole. At that time, we thought there's still enough time left in the clock that we could go on the ground. We pick up a first down. Time's running out. We get thrown for the 2 losses. And then on the stop and lateral, Dean Blevins did a good job with it. Elvis ran by, got the lateral from Steve Rhodes, and it was executed maybe better than we do in practice.
Steve Rhodes, the freshman from Dallas, Texas, who made the big catch and lateral play work.
Mike.
That's not Oklahoma football. They run the wishbone.
Well, that was 76, and from what my research was, that was the birth of Sooner Magic, but it would continue on. And to your point, those first 5 years were rough for Osborne, not because he was losing a bunch of games. He wasn't. It was just that one game. And then it's 78, and let's start to talk about that 78 game here. Nebraska loses at the beginning of the season to Alabama. In fact, well, actually, this is a marquee year in Husker history because a certain sports writer for the Lincoln Journal is brought on board in 1978 as well. So this is your first season covering the Huskers, right?
Yeah, right.
And
that, that Alabama game was Tom Surley wore EJ Jr. like a shirt. I mean, Junior was there just all over the place, and but Nebraska recovered, and that was the thing, that they had the great effort. Barry Switzer, in his book Bootlegger's Boy, says that he thinks that he thought the 74 team was the best team that he had coached, but as he thought back about it, he thought maybe the 78 team was the best team that he coached.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw that, we saw that, I guess, when they beat Nebraska in the Orange Bowl, when it turns around and they beat them there.
Mm.
But number 1, Oklahoma loses to number 4, Nebraska. And that was the one deficiency of the wishbone, was the potential to fumble. And that day, 9 fumbles, 6 of which were lost. And I'll never forget that. I've got a picture up on my wall back. You can't see it, but of the play where Jim Pillen recovers a fumble, and it's forced by I think Jeff Hansen and Andy Means. 3 minutes and 27 seconds left. Billy Sims had a 27-yard run or whatever.
Great run,
he fumbles
too.
the ball at the 3, and Nebraska recovers.
Yeah, Switzer said that in one of the videos where, gosh, we fumbled 9 times and everything and lost 6. Well, they should have lost 1 more, including this one.
They're going to say that Oklahoma's player hit the ground before he lost the ball. Apparently that's what they're saying. And Nebraska's recovery of the fumble back at the 10 is not going to stand. The officials are saying they blew the ball dead. And Tom Osborne is really hot on the far side. He's coming out to talk to an official. Now they're sending him back. And this crowd is really wild. I'll tell you, that was an unbelievable thing.
John Rood and Kelly Phelps.
And Osborne is really mad. And you think about the pressure he's under right there. He's lost 5 straight, and I mean, clear as day, that's a fumble, right?
Yeah.
And what a terrible gaffe of a call. And Osborne's upset. The fans, you heard the crowd there over the audio. They're frustrated. I mean, nobody wants to lose to Oklahoma for a 6th straight time. And to get that final play that Jim Pillen lands on the fumble, they get the victory. I want to play this audio for you, and this is Jerry Moore post game and a little bit of Kent Pavelka, but just the elation that the coach had for Tom to get the win.
As everybody knows, he's just super, and I just want to repeat what you guys have already said. We're happy for our players and all the coaches and the people of Nebraska, but Tom, as much as anything, for Coach Osborne, it's a super, super win for him.
Yeah, I guess so. 17-14, Nebraska beats Oklahoma, and I really am at a complete loss of what to ask for the first time in my life. What can you say about the monumental game that this was, what this means, what this win means to your program?
What this win means to the program, and I completely understand what Pavelka's saying at that moment. I mean, now you're going to turn around next week. You're going to beat that Missouri team. You're going to go on to bowl game. What's this going to lead to? And unfortunately, as you had said earlier, Mike, the frustration is that it didn't lead to something. The next week, in one of the only 3 seasons where we aren't finishing the season with Oklahoma, we have Missouri come in, and for the 3rd straight time in Lincoln, Missouri came out with a victory.
35-31, right?
Mm-hmm.
Game of the century.
Game of the century. And we talked about the motivation to play in a bowl game earlier, right? When you have the motivation, you can do great things. Well, it was a real kick in the gut for Osborne and our team to have to go and play Oklahoma again. But this is how Oklahoma took the reaction from Switzer in the locker room.
All right, now what has happened is that with Georgia getting beat, the Tide is like getting beat, so that puts Alabama. Penn State more than likely is going to go to the Sugar Bowl to play Alabama. Now what it does to us, that does this. The Orange Bowl is meeting right now in an executive meeting. They're considering, I don't know, the possibility of taking us, or probably more likely ask us to come play Nebraska again in Orange Bowl.
I think OU wanted to play Nebraska in the Orange Bowl there.
Yeah, that was not the right thing to do. Whatever. I didn't, at that point, it may have happened before, but I'd never seen that before where you had a rematch in a bowl game.
Yeah, especially in that era. Yeah.
Just garbage. But a shared colleague of ours, Carl Vogel, but I work with him now, but you used to work with Carl. He went to the 78 Orange Bowl. So he has fond memories of walking around the neighborhood right around the Orange Bowl Stadium. I guess that was it was a little sketchy at times back then. But anyways, that led to a lot of the frustration you're talking about after that offseason. Coach Osborne, for the only time really that publicly at least, entertained leaving Nebraska. And it was just, am I ever going to be able to do enough? And, the things that were starting to beat Nebraska, or the things that were beating Nebraska against Oklahoma, the mobile quarterback, the Thomas Lotts, the J.C. Watts, Nebraska was, playing a passing attack, the Ferragamos, Hums, that style. And Osborne started to look at spectively at himself, at his program, and says, we need to have quarterbacks that can do things with their legs the way that Oklahoma quarterbacks can. And Osborne would go head to head against Switzer down in Fort Worth for the services of Turner Gill. And we start to see the change, the switch in the offense. We go into the triple option. We get to, those early 80s where we start to have our own little winning streak, 81, 82, 83. Let's start to focus on that era, the early 80s.
Yeah, that was one of the things that Tom was not inflexible. He made changes when they needed to be made, and that was one of the things that he looked at and said, we need to have a quarterback that can run. If you're going to be successful, in oversimplified terms, if you're going to be successful in the Big 8, you've got to play the way Oklahoma plays, because Oklahoma is the one that dominates the conference. And so the first quarterback that Tom recruited, I think, that fit that mold was Jeff Quinn out of Ord, Nebraska. And then he got Nate Mason from Greenville, Texas. Nate Mason and Ricky Simmons came up here. Then he got Turner Gill, and there was a big competition with Oklahoma, although Turner, I think, sensed that Oklahoma wanted him as a defensive back, not as quarterback. But, that's how it evolved. That Turner Gill could run. He could have been a pro passer if that's what you wanted him to do. He was just a really talented guy. Well, and then you add to it great offensive lines, Dave Remington anchoring the line, and you had Dean Steinkuhler in the line, and you had
Trent Woods.
And of course Mike Rozier and Roger Craig and Irving Fryer. Yep, I got that poster still. The scoring explosion they were.
That 82 season, my first memories from start to finish of a season is 1983. I mean, I remember the kickoff classic 44-6 against Penn State, and I haven't forgot a game since. But I didn't recognize, I was just too young. I was 5 in 82, so I didn't quite catch on to what that season was about. But the offensive talent on that 82 team, because you have the scoring explosion, but you still have Remington, you still have Roger Craig, you also have Jamie Williams, tight end. I mean, that is an amazing, group of talent there. And of course, these are the, keeping it with the Oklahoma talk, these are years that we're beating Oklahoma. Now, was Oklahoma down at this time, during the early 80s, or was Nebraska just that good? I know they had Marcus Dupree and,
it wasn't like, the 81 game, Turner couldn't play because he got the leg injury in the Iowa State game, the previous game. And so Mark Maurer stepped in, and Nebraska won that game 37-14 down in Norman. I don't think it was a great Oklahoma team, but it was a scrap in 82 and it was a scrap in 83 with Oklahoma. And I don't remember if the Sooners were ranked during that time. There was a little bit of a downswing there. then they came back up, and then there was really a slide for Oklahoma when Switzer left, and then they started changing coaches and so that affected them there. But it was the frustration of having to play them again in that bowl game. Didn't impact the recruiting, obviously, because Nebraska recruited really well and was aggressive from that standpoint. Again, even though the coach had, considered going to Colorado.
Had considered.
And like Devaney before him, Tom had kind of surveyed his staff and said, "Hey, should we look into this?" And they all said, "Yeah, let's give it a shot." So, I mean, he was loyal to the people that were loyal to him, but recruiting was really, Frank did a good job in New Jersey. They got Rozier. He spent 1 year in community college, Coffeyville Community College, came up to Nebraska. Then you got in '82, like you said, you've got Roger Craig and Mike Rozier, and you've got a Roger Craig who says, "I'll try fullback." If that can get us both on the field, and then he kind of got banged up and moved back to I-back. But tremendous talent there. That scoring explosion. Those three guys are recognized at it, but again, that offensive line was really an important part of it, and you had the fullback that was an important part of it, and Nebraska had an outstanding team. 81, 82, 83 through that stretch.
And really running that triple option, something that started with Osborne, I think, trying to bring more of an Oklahoma style of offense, getting
exactly.
mobile cute.
Exactly. That was you had Turner Gill, and then you had Steve Taylor, and you got those quarterbacks that could do both, that could run and could pass. And that was important to where that program was going to go and win those national championships.
Now, Mike, we're getting out of the 81 to 83 era. Now we're going to move into the 84. And I hate to jump around here, but I forgot one video, and I have to show you the video. This is 1980, and if you could give us a little bit of context after this. Switzer shows up on the Bob Devaney show on a Friday night. Surprises Dick Janda. I want to show this for the Redcasters, but if you can give a little context after this.
Here we go.
And I would go over and talk to Dick Jana, who does the show. I've known for years that does Tom Osborne's show and Bob's show out of Lincoln. And I said, "Dick, let me do this. Let me hide behind the stage. And Bob comes on. I want to walk up and give him a sack of tacos."
We hope to give it to Barry Switzer. In case Barry didn't get to go to the Orange Bowl, he could eat the pineapple instead of the tamales that they served down there in El Paso.
Well, Ray,
really, that was the thing.
Thanks very much for being here. I guess we pulled out all. Whoa, wait a minute here. I guess he's in person here.
Goddamn Barry.
Hey, I appreciate the pineapple, but I've got a couple of tacos for you, Bob.
Oh, God. Hey, one of the greatest coaches in the country, and it's great to be here with us here.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
I want to tell you
and I'll tell you, wherever we go, we're well fed.
I mean, the question we had earlier, that shows a little bit about the relationship between Oklahoma and Nebraska, that Barry could do that, and that Bob would take it in, that Bob would do what he did, and then they would both take it in the way that they did. Nebraska ended up going to the Sun Bowl.
And Bob and Barry are more alike than Bob and Tom were.
Yeah. No question about that. Very much so. And that was part of it. Yeah, well, it was a good relationship that they had.
Well, my first year, like I said, I remember 83. We beat Oklahoma, but then what I remember is that the next 4 years really were tough. Those were formative years for me, and it was losing Oklahoma at the end of each of those seasons. Some of the Sooner magic being involved. But I want to show something first. And Boomer, I think you can talk a little bit about this. It doesn't have anything to do with Nebraska and Oklahoma, but it has to do with the college football landscape today. There was a lawsuit that Oklahoma had against the NCAA in 1984, had to deal some with television, correct, Boomer? And started to lead to maybe some of the stuff that we're starting to see now with USC and UCLA and conference expansion. Can you talk a little there?
Yeah, basically the way college football was kind of broadcast back then is the NCAA basically controlled the rights of who could be seen and when, and they would limit schools' appearances. I think they were limited to like 6 appearances on TV a year, any particular school, and only 4 of those could be national broadcasts. And they had to, the broadcast stations had to put like 82 or 84 different schools on during the year at some point. So you were really limited to where it was. And I think Barry Switzer got really annoyed. I think it was 81. They were playing USC. It was I would think a 1 versus 2 matchup. And there were several stations that carried the Citadel versus Appalachian State rather than, playing Oklahoma USC. And that kind of, teased everybody, with what they had. And, one thing led to another, and it kept going through lawsuits. And eventually went to the Supreme Court. I think it was a 7-2 decision where the Supreme Court basically kind of blew up that old model of how, of who controlled television rights for football. And this kind of opened the floodgates to schools controlling media rights, conferences taking over. And it really kind of led to what we see today with, that led to the death of a lot of the independent schools. Your Penn States and Miami's and Florida States felt the pressure to join conferences. And
then conferences like the Southwest and the Big
Southwest
Eight.
And the Big Eight couldn't really compete. This is where Notre Dame was able to start getting their own big deal, which kind of, set the stage for all of this. And really, if you want to go back to what changed football, it took a while to kind of, percolate through. You had to get cable up and running, and now streaming and the huge media rights deals. But that's kind of where it all begins with Oklahoma in '84. So with that court decision.
Yeah, TV exposure was really important. I mean, it helped Nebraska,
Sure.
He walked on here from Chapin, South Carolina, said he had watched Nebraska on TV. That's where he got, that's a long way to come. But they had that kind of exposure. And that was before this, and then this just opened it up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, 84 to 86. When you see this guy's face, I mean, what does this make you think?
The Boz.
The Boz.
It makes me think of we used to have the Big 8 Skyriders tour,
mm-hmm.
and you would take a bus to places like Kansas and Kansas State or whatever, but it would all start in Kansas City and it would finish in Oklahoma, I think, and you'd take flights to various places. And I remember the Skyriders stop in Norman, Oklahoma when I think he was a sophomore, maybe he was a junior. Anyway, Brian Bosworth was one of the players that we had available to us, and he came out. He had a button-down collar shirt. I mean, he just looked like a preppy, like a collegiate preppy. But he started talking, and the one thing I remember him saying was he hated orange and he hated Texas. And he was from Texas, but he was at Oklahoma. So that kind of tells you where that Texas-Oklahoma thing was. But yeah, the Boz. That's how I first remember him, with this button-down collar shirt. He didn't look anything like that.
Well, we lose all 3 of those games: 84, 85, 86, and 87.
87.
Yeah, 87. We talked about the game of the century one, 1971. Well, I remember this. I remember my mom, I think she must have got it at Hinky Dinky in Columbus, but the Husker hanky, and I had that hanging in my room, and it was Nebraska, Oklahoma, November 21st, 1987. And that was a big game, number 1 versus number 2 again, Nebraska at home. And this is the year, Mike, we're going to beat these guys and that streak. Mm-hmm. That's going to be I was going to be a very happy kid, and it didn't happen again.
Yeah, and the curious thing was that the week before, Oklahoma was 1 and Nebraska was 2, and they flip-flopped before the game. And, the week before the game, they flip-flopped in the rankings so that Nebraska was number 1 and Oklahoma was number 2. And I don't know whether the people that voted just said, hey, we're going to have a game of the century 2. It's got to be Nebraska's got to be number 1 because it's in Lincoln or whatever, or, however you want to put it together. It just seemed strange that they would do it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But the final score, it wasn't that close. I mean, it was pretty one-sided. Oklahoma dominated that game.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that takes us to 1988, and it's a significant game because Osborne, we win, and it was a ice bowl down in Norman. Nebraska wins 7-3, I believe. But it's the last game, the final game of the Switzer era. And as you mentioned earlier, Switzer ends his career against Nebraska 5-12. So Osborne, to think about, what's going to happen here for him to finish his career against Oklahoma 13-13, at the end of 1988, Osborne's sitting at 5-12. He has a lot of ground to make up, but they win that final game, and now Oklahoma. They're, Switzer didn't just leave on his own. There was some help pushing him out, and you start to get in some probations. And Oklahoma now starts to feel the hurt from that, getting into the Gary Gibbs era and all that. And Osborne, obviously, we know what Nebraska did in the 90s, but that was really an end of an era. 1988, Switzer's done.
Yeah, that things went downhill essentially for Oklahoma after that. The only win that Oklahoma had against Nebraska the rest of Tom's tenure was the one where they ran Mickey Joseph into that bench and got the laceration of his leg, and that was not exactly a cordial situation.
No, that stadium down there in Norman, you were right on the field. I mean, there's no sideline space or anything. I can remember that push, and it was just like, oh no. And that was a rough end of that year. But we get into the 90s. I mean, now this is just fun talk I didn't even have any graphics or videos of this. This is just fun chat now. It's 90s, and it's just going to be win after win after win. Boomer, 91. You mentioned that. We win that, go to the Orange Bowl there. Johnny Mitchell I remember him having, some catches in there, and it was just
Calvin Jones had a big touchdown at the end to win it,
which he technically dropped before he got into the end zone. But we're not going to even
no replay.
No replay. In fact, strike that. Redcasters didn't even say that. Mike,
we will take replay of Penn State in '82.
Absolutely, we absolutely will. Well, Mike, tell us what was it like to be covering the Huskers there in the early '90s? What's it like when we start to transition? We had Damon Benning on back in April, and I asked him about, he got there in '92, and then his last game was in '96, so he got to be there as part of the transition where, we were doing again, kind of like the Devaney era where we're still going 6-4. We weren't terrible in 89, 90, 91. We're winning 9 games or whatever, but we're just but there's a shift. Something happened around the early 90s. What was it like to be covering that, to see that shift, and what was going on that you saw where Nebraska went from being a good 9-10 win team to all of a sudden, boom, what we saw?
Well, I think it had to do with recruiting. And here's another thing that really made an impact was, I said Tom wasn't set in his ways. He was willing to make changes as he did with the offense, and they went from a 50 front to a 4-3 defense because he thought they needed to get more speed in the defense, and they needed to be more aggressive on defense because they were having problems with playing in these bowl games against teams that threw the ball. And so he adjusted. You brought Ed Stewart in. He was a safety, and they made him a linebacker, and he becomes an All-American linebacker. They made those adjustments. It was Tom's ability to adjust that enabled the Huskers to win 3 national championships in his final 4 seasons. And really, as you look back through Tom's time, there weren't too many seasons where at some point during that season, Nebraska wasn't in a position to win the national championship. The Clemson Bowl game after the 81 season or whatever, Nebraska could have been national champs that year. Just almost every year, Nebraska had an opportunity at some point. The Penn State thing, if that play hadn't gone the way it did, Nebraska won that game, probably would have played for a national championship, could have won a national championship that year. And it finally started to fall into place in the 90s. And I think I remember the 94 Orange Bowl, standing outside the stadium waiting for the shuttle to take the media back to the hotel. It was probably 2:00 in the morning or whatever. We'd written the stories or whatever. And I thought, I've got to approach this job as if every game will be my last. I've got to appreciate every game. Maybe something that I'd kind of done, I think. Because when I first started covering the games, it's like, wow, I'm sitting on the 50-yard line in the press box. I'm going to all the games. This is great. But it quickly became the people that I was dealing with, the coaches, the players, the administrators, the fans. That's what kept me going. And And that's why I've done what I've done for as long as I've done it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the people. It's not, the games are kind of secondary to me. But it was that night I thought, treat every game as if it's going to be your last, because you never know when you're going to quit doing this or when you're not going to be able to do it, and appreciate it for that. And I think I did that, but it just came into focus for me at that point.
Mm-hmm. Well, things just came together for the program in those 90s, and 60-3 over the last 5 years, 4 undefeated regular seasons, 3 undefeated seasons, 4 national championship games, 3 of them won. But it's this 25 years of Osborne. And I think some people think it's this straight trajectory all the way up, from the start to the end. And it's this constant up and down. It's the Oklahoma. They're running it on us, and now we need to switch it up, get Turner Gill to match with what they're doing. As you mentioned, 10 years later, when people are saying we need to throw the ball like Florida State and Miami, Osborne saying we need to play defense like Florida State and Miami. And again, he's adjusting. And the pinnacle is those last 5 years, and we were good throughout, but it wasn't just this straight trajectory. There was for the young Redcasters that if you look romantically on it, like it was just 25 glorious years and, we were happy dory all the time. No, we weren't. It was, Osborne was constantly under pressure. You lose to Oklahoma early, you can't win the big game. You lose 7 straight bowl games. You run the ball too much. How about that for run the damn ball guy? We ran the ball too much back then. We'd love to have that back again.
255, 49, and 3, and you look at it and say, well, yeah, it was just right up the line to those national championships. No, it wasn't. You're exactly right. It was a roller coaster ride for Tom. Mm-hmm. And, you look at it, the evidence wouldn't support that. Every season, at least 9 wins and a bowl game every season. And like I said, the majority of those seasons, you could look at some point in the season and say, Nebraska could be in contention for the national title, because that's how good Tom's teams were.
Every year. The 80s, we were the team of the 80s, I think, never won a national title in the 80s, but had won the most games in the team of the 80s there. We're not talking as much about Oklahoma right now in the 90s because the Oklahoma was going through a down period. Yeah. And Nebraska, so we beat them. Now, some of them were still close games, 83 or 93 and 94. There were close games. By 95, the last game of the Big 8, Nebraska is at 37-0, shutout. That's what ends the Big 8 conference, the last game of that conference. And although we would go on to play them the next 2 years, 96 and 97, we're now entering into the Big 12 era. Oklahoma, in some ways, I don't blame them here. They had an opportunity, I'm sure, in the South Division. They could have had a crossover game and played us every year. I'm sure if they wanted to agree to it. Why would you agree to that if you're Oklahoma? Why would you be the only team in the South to play at that time, this team that's a juggernaut? We'll play them every year. Oh, and we'll play A&M and Texas and Oklahoma State. And those teams won't have to play Nebraska every year. I get it. But it ended, essentially, it was going to end the ongoing rivalry. We play them 2 more times. I was at that game in 96 in Norman. So up until last year, because I went to the game last year in Norman, but I've been to 2 games in Norman. I saw us blow them out in 96, and I saw us down 35-0 at the end of the first quarter in 2008. Love that stadium. I absolutely love Norman. It's a great place to go and watch a game, but I watched 2 blowouts until last season was a good game. But we blow them out in 96, and Osborne in 97 gets his 250th victory on a 69-7. I mean, it was just, for Oklahoma, it was kind of a sad way to see that part of the era, end, because they were not good there in the mid-90s.
Yeah, and Tom made some comments about that, that he felt badly that, the games got out of hand and that Oklahoma had sort of dropped to where it did. I think he was sincere in that.
Well, I just want to ask, maybe we can have a little discussion here. Here's the Sports Illustrated there, and it's kind of the end of the era. I mean, I guess I want to get both your thoughts. I'll start with you, Boomer. You're from Texas, but you guys have both mentioned this multiple times here. Oklahoma and Texas have a rivalry with each other, a hatred, of border war. Oklahoma, for what it's worth, also has their in-state one with Oklahoma State with Bedlam. But when it came down to picking your rival or whatever, it's pretty clear in the 90s. Oklahoma made that decision, right, Boomer?
Yeah, and it's for all the reasons you both mentioned. Like Mike said, it's the hatred is there, and that's part of what makes a fun rivalry to a large degree is hatred. I mean, we had a different scenario with Oklahoma, And then just when it comes down to, like you'd said, who are you going to play every season? Oklahoma wants that connection with Texas on a regular basis just for recruiting and everything else their plan is. And the way the Big 12 was being set up, maybe in retrospect, they could have done something different.
Yeah,
East-West
or something.
East-West sort of thing. So it's not so much the old Southwest versus the old Big 8. They could have divided it up something different. But I can't blame Oklahoma for doing what they did. It made the most sense at the time and with the structure of the conference and the way it was going to be. And it actually kind of did work out for them the way it looks. Yeah, they made the right decision.
Well, if you think about 1995, the last year of the Big 8, we had 4 teams in the top 10, and all 4 of them were from what was going to be the Big 12 North. Kansas, K-State, and Colorado and Nebraska all finished in the top 10. I mean, that was the dominating side at that freeze frame picture in time. Mike, what are your thoughts in 95 and 96, the Big 12 starting to come into existence? What are your thoughts as this rivalry was going to – it didn't end, but it was going to end on an annual basis after the 97 season?
Yeah, well, for me personally, it was disappointment because, again, my favorite game that I've ever been at was the 78 Oklahoma-Nebraska game, and not counting bowl games, my favorite place to visit for road games was always Norman, Oklahoma, because of that connection that I had with, growing up with Nebraska, Oklahoma, kind of a thing. So I was disappointed from that standpoint, but as Boomer said, it made sense. I mean, there wasn't any way you were going to define it you weren't going to put those teams in the same division. It wasn't going to work. There wasn't any way you could break things down so that it would work, that it would make any kind of sense. Nowadays, you could have done it because nothing makes any sense. You do what you want to do.
At one point, the Big 12 had 10 teams and the Big 10 had 12.
Yeah.
Who cares?
But, in that situation, the way it was then, the way times were, it just made sense that had to be. My first thought was, I don't think Nebraska even needs to go to the Big 12. It needs to stay the Big 8. That is always my feeling. But realistically, that was not a good idea because you have all of a sudden when Nebraska left the Big 12, I thought shouldn't have done that either. But you look at it, it's like, well, Missouri would have taken that place if Nebraska hadn't gone to the Big 10. Missouri leaves, Colorado leaves, the old Big 8 is all fractured, so it fell apart anyway.
Well, I think those Husker fans that were frustrated 2 years ago in COVID and saying we should go back to the Big 12, I'm glad those people didn't get their way.
Right. The one thing that frustrated me more than anything was that I remember someone saying, it's just the addition of these 4 teams from Texas. It's not going to change. They're just joining the Big 8. And immediately the conference headquarters goes from Kansas City down to Texas, and it's obvious that Texas comes in and starts running the conference.
Yep, a bunch of 1 to 11 votes. Yep, a bunch of 1 to 11 votes, and we were on the
see that. Yeah, Nebraska. Even the old the Big 8 schools never sided with Nebraska. They always
Prop
sided
48.
with the other.
Yeah, Prop 48 went away, and Nebraska was the one of that. It was just
why was that? It was because Nebraska had dominated. That's why.
Absolutely.
We're going to get even with them now. We're going to vote against that. I mean, there was an element of that. We're going to vote against them. Whatever they want, we're against it.